Madison, a great man, but he was certainly the closest partner intellectually and politically that Thomas Jefferson had. And when Jefferson became president and Madison was his Secretary of State, I'm aware of no peep that Madison made when Jefferson was encouraging governors in his own party to prosecute Federalist editors under state sedition laws, which did not allow truth as a defense. And the killer phrase, which was kind of made famous by Leonard Levy over 25 years ago, was a letter from Jefferson to the governor of, I think, Pennsylvania. And he says, "We don't want a general prosecution, but a select persecution, of some of these terrible slanderers would be a good thing." So, none of these men, and not even Tom Paine, who was not a politician. He was just, like me, he was a journalist. That was his day job. But Tom Paine even said, we are just opposed to licensing. But of course, if people then, tell lies, well, of course they can be prosecuted. So, anybody who's looking to import our notions of press freedom back into the 18th century, it's not going to work. We are choosing among, and maybe we're being presentist, but we're choosing among greater resemblances to the kind of state of perfection that we have arrived at with our superior virtue. Yes, the gentleman on the aisle up there.
Sometime Karl Marx is reputed to have said of some of his disciples, if you people are spouting Marxism, I am not a Marxist. If Hamilton would have been able to come back from the 1930s and onwards, and seeing FDR and his successors described as Hamiltonians, would he, as Hamilton, have said, "If this is Hamiltonianism, I am not a Hamiltonian"?
Well, let me just have a quick reaction to that. FDR would not have said he was a Hamiltonian. FDR hated Hamilton. I think the only book review he ever wrote, which was in the 20s or 30s, it was a review of a book by a man named Claude Bowers, which said there was this great opposition in the American soul between Jefferson and Hamilton, and Bowers was in favor of Jefferson, and Roosevelt wrote this review, and he said, yes, this is terrific, and when will there be a modern Jefferson to arise nowadays to perform, to stand as a champion of the people? We so badly need him. And it was FDR who built the Jefferson Memorial. It was FDR who put Jefferson on the nickel. Certainly in his own mind, and we can quibble if his policies fulfill that. In his own mind, he was the enemy of Hamilton because Hamilton spoke for the rich guys, and FDR didn't. Any other comments on that?
Herbert Crowley, a progressive, attempted to mate these two men back around 1910 or so. What was the name of that book?
The Promise of American Life.
The Promise of American Life. And he said we should use Hamiltonian means to bring about Jeffersonian ends. In other words, Jefferson's approach to helping the common man no longer meant little government. It meant big government in a complex industrial society. So he argued that they could be mated for modern times.
Yes, the lady there.
I just want to mirror an earlier question and ask this panel, what do you think is the reason that Jefferson gets all the credit for being the great civil libertarian as opposed to Hamilton? I mean, at the very least, they both made their contributions, but why is there this, it's become a pervasive belief that really it's Jefferson and that Hamilton almost has nothing to do with it?
Well, Jefferson wrote the sacred words of American history. Yeah. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, this is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said all the things that real Americans would want to say. And that's never been my quarrel with Thomas Jefferson. My quarrel with Thomas Jefferson is he didn't do them.
I think, just to underline that, I think many of the founders were good writers. And I think Hamilton was a good writer. I would say only 4 of them were great writers. and Jefferson is the most prominent of the great writers. The other three, I would pick Franklin, Paine, and Morris. But, for people that you would just read just for pleasure and for no other reason of edification or anything, I mean, Jefferson just hits that level a lot, and that has an effect.
Just in one quick defense of Jefferson on civil liberties, he did make a very important contribution to religious freedom with the in the state of Virginia, and I think in freedom of the press, in some ways, I think it was really Madison who was the great press libertarian, and sort of Jefferson's association with Madison and Jefferson getting credit actually for a lot of what Madison said and thought on that particular issue that I think gives a kind of glow to Jefferson on press liberty that he doesn't entirely deserve. But on religious liberty, Jefferson really was a leader.
The gentleman in the front row. Yes, you do. It's coming.
Dare I bring psychology into it? No, never, right?
Have some fun.
And Aaron Burr, too. There seems to be definitely an emphasis of boldness, self-confidence, and maybe even rashness in these two individuals. And I would say that Hamilton is the only founding father with a famous father, stepfather, to be sure, the civil libertarian lawyer, Andrew Hamilton. And Jonathan Edwards, of course, is the ancestor of Aaron Burr. And I think since all the Eastern founders had great educations, Columbia and Yale and Harvard, of course, I think this might be a foundation to investigate, at least liberty-wise. Certainly having a libertarian lawyer as a father is something that's always spoken of in the household, rights of people, etc.
I think the question was what was the relationship to Hamilton and possibly also to Aaron Burr of their forebears, real or symbolic?
I don't want to touch it. I think it's an interesting question. I just don't know have any evidence on it.
Well, I have to disagree with the premise of the question. I think what is remarkable about Alexander Hamilton is that more than any other prominent founder, he comes from nowhere and nothing. Benjamin Franklin was as poor. Benjamin Franklin's parents were married, and in that sense, they were perfectly respectable people. And no one ever called Benjamin Franklin a bastard brat because he was not. Hamilton was illegitimate, down on the social scale, and he came from someplace else. He made his fathers himself. He found them. He fastened himself to them. I think Washington, it was a very complex relationship, but he did find that relationship. And I think his main paternity was in the books he read. It was the Plutarch. It was Malachi Postlethwaite and all these economists that we've forgotten even their names. But that's where Hamilton's true paternity was.
Yeah, the reason that I started with talking about Hamilton in the West Indies is because I really do think that helped to shape him at the very beginning of his life. And I think that he learned from that, and I think you can follow that influence for the rest of his life. Think about it. When he was starting the Manumission Society in New York, to whom was he appealing? His friends, his supporters. We're talking about business people who made their living in one way or another, directly or indirectly connected to the slave production or slave trading. He was not appealing to his supporters. And I mean, it seems to me you got to give the man credit. He didn't have to do that. Jefferson said, I would do this, but it would upset my neighbors. And we can understand it would upset his neighbors. But Hamilton would upset his neighbors too. Yet he did it. And it seems to me that we need to recognize that. We don't go too far with this, but it is worth saying. And the thing is, it is hardly ever said. That's why I think it's important.
The gentleman here.
As a follow-up, Professor Horton just mentioned...
The mic doesn't seem to be working.
Try it again.
Test it.
Excuse me?
Yes, you're
Okay.
working.
As a follow-up to what Professor Horton just was mentioning, could you talk a little bit about the process by which slavery was ended in New York and what extent Hamilton played a role in that?
Sure. Well, slavery was ended in New York gradually. In the early years of the 19th century, there was real, in the late years of the 18th century, there was real pressure to end the institution. But of course, New York was a major slave-holding area. New York City, particularly, the Hudson River Valley was one of the only two places in the North where you had real plantations. Narragansett region of Rhode Island and the Hudson River Valley. These are real plantations equivalent to some of the plantations in the South. So slavery was a major institution here, and those like Hamilton put pressure, which resulted in the passage of a gradual emancipation law, where slaves, as they reached a certain age, would come out of slavery. And in fact, slavery wasn't actually abolished in New York State until the middle 1820s. But the fact is that the process was set into motion by Hamilton and his generation. And that I think is significant. And again, I want to stress that was not an easy thing to do in New York at the time.
Well, it's interesting to note that New York was the second to the last of the states to abolish slavery, finally. New Jersey, not until the 1840s. And it's important to remember that up until the Civil War, many northern states allowed Southerners to bring slaves into the states for a period of 9 months to a year. And they wouldn't be freed if you returned to the South with your slave before that expiration. And remember, Pennsylvania already had such a law when Washington was president, and he was very concerned about his black servants that he had brought from Virginia, that they would, if he didn't take them back, they'd qualify for freedom under Pennsylvania law.
Well, it was New Jersey actually set their emancipation laws into motion in the early part of the 19th century. It's just that it was gradual emancipation.
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
A little known fact, at the time of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery generally in the nation, there were still 13 or 16 slaves in New Jersey. That were freed technically by the 13th Amendment. So that, this is a process. But the fact is that to set the process into motion, there were commitments to the founding principles. And that, I think, obviously is something that we ought to pay attention to. That's where Hamilton comes in, and he does a decent job at that point.
One more detail supporting your point that this was hard, and this appears in the minutes of the Manumission Society, that early on there's a committee of three. It's Hamilton, it's Robert Troup, I forget the third guy, and they present to their fellows a recommendation that all members of the Manumission Society free their own slaves. This doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should give them some credit. They were setting in motion a process, but here again, Hamilton is ahead of the curve, even in this group, which is itself ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Lest we be too smug in New York City, understand that New York City debated secession from the United States at the time just before the American Civil War.
The gentleman with the blazer and the tie there.
Thank you. Those of us who subscribe to the view that the Hamiltonian vision of economic opportunity, economic liberty, was preferable to the more static Jeffersonian view, and that this view indeed was carried forward by the Northern Whigs and Abraham Lincoln in the original Republican Party. Nevertheless, are a little concerned about one episode from Hamilton's career, and this is on the subject of something that Professor Horton mentioned, the upstate manners. Of course, the Schuyler family had one of the bigger ones. It's my understanding that these upstate manors, and I don't know how many slaves actually worked on them, were mainly run by white indentured tenant farmers who were basically living in a form of peonage, in the sense that if they couldn't pay their annual rent on their land, the sheriffs would come in and auction all their personal property and they would be destitute. And in the 1830s, of course, long after Hamilton was dead, there was an uprising called the Anti-Rent Wars, and the New York Constitution was amended, and so on and so forth. But, according to my information, Hamilton, acting on behalf of his in-laws, drafted up some of the early laws or contractual provisions or even constitutional provisions that perpetuated this land tenancy system in upstate New York. And would any of you like to comment on that?
Yeah, let me comment on that briefly. The system was in place long before Hamilton was born and came here. I mean, this goes back to the Dutch system, and then it goes back to what the English set up as soon as they got the place. And you know, as has been said before, Hamilton was not the perfect man, and he didn't lead any rent revolts against the Schuylers or the Van Rensselaers or anyone like that. What he did do was there was an instance where it was going to be expanded into Vermont. You know, and this was a very prickly situation. New Yorkers had a lot of land claims in Vermont, and they wanted to extend their whole system to what is now a state. But they had claims on significant chunks of Vermont. The Vermonters, not surprisingly, didn't want any part and parcel of the New York system, which, as you say, was very retrograde, very feudal. And one of the New Yorkers who opposed his own state's effort to imperialize Vermont was Hamilton. And he said, look, let's be realistic. It is a separate society. They don't like us. They don't like the laws we have. It's going to be a hornet's nest. We just don't want to get into this. And cooler heads prevailed, and New York didn't get into it. So I think he deserves some credit for not making the problem bigger. We have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi. Is this thing working?
Yes.
Many wonderful things have been said, but I want you to imagine a kind of duel between two different constitutions.
That's a freighted word.
All right. One of these constitutions is built on the notion of states' rights and says any power not given to the national government, to the Confederation, you might say, is reserved to the states. And the other deliberately avoids that language because it recognizes that circumstances change. We've talked a lot about Hamilton working to get rid of slavery through gentle means, but he was aware that America might eventually have a civil war. Would you be willing to think about the possibility that the reason the Union won the Civil War is because it had a Hamiltonian constitution, and the reason the South lost the Civil War is because it had a Jeffersonian one?
Any takers?
Well, it had a Hamiltonian constitution and a strong industrial infrastructure.
There is a book by a distinguished Southern historian named Frank Owsley called States' Rights in the Confederacy. And his theory is the South lost the war because of states' rights, that they were so deeply wedded to the ideas of limited government and so forth, they couldn't engage in the kind of bold, daring, revolutionary activities that were necessary to win a Southern Revolution.
Sorry.
Last thing, there's something we ought to think about when we start talking about the South and its support of states' rights. In 1850, the United States government passed something called the Fugitive Slave Law. That was a federal law, which overrode state law. We had personal liberties laws in places like Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Massachusetts and so on, but that federal law overrode state law, making it imperative for states, whether they liked it or not, to participate in the capture and return of fugitive slaves. Now, if you're a supporter of states' rights, how do you stand on that law? I do not know of a single Confederate supporter who said, I stand for states' rights. I stand opposed to the fugitive slave law. So my question is this. Under what conditions do we find these people believing in states' rights? And the bigger question, the state's right to do what?
Well, and that's precisely the kind of precise and realistic question that I think Hamilton at his best would have asked. And on that note, have a good lunch.